Cheating on a partner is one of the biggest taboos in any relationship, but often, desire ends up overpowering what is right and wrong. Have you ever stopped to think how temptation can slip into the most unexpected moments of your life? Imagine being in such a vulnerable place that a simple exchange of glances could make you make a decision that will change everything. This is the kind of story many prefer to keep secret, but when exposed, it brings to light the complex emotions and consequences of infidelity. You might be thinking, how could this happen to someone so focused and balanced? The truth is, betrayal doesn't choose the moment, nor the ideal situation. What starts as a momentary weakness can turn into a game of seduction, where desire mixes with guilt, and the line between right and wrong becomes blurred. What do you do when you find yourself trapped between love, desire, and shame? This story reveals the darker side of choices many people try to hide, but deep down we've all wondered, how far would you go for a forbidden desire? In this account, what seemed like a simple temptation transforms into an internal battle of emotions, and you'll understand how every decision can have repercussions that go far beyond what you imagine. So, prepare for a story that will make you reflect on how far choices, desires, and betrayals can take us. Alexia found herself in a difficult cycle where financial pressure took over her mind every day. With 3 months of overdue rent, the feeling of sinking was constant. Her biggest concern wasn't the bills, but the looming phone calls from her boss, Mr. X. Until recently, their interactions had been direct, simple, and purely professional. However, something had changed. It was as if there was a tension in the air, an invisible line between them that was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. What confused her even more was the way he looked at her, the way his gaze seemed to descend over her figure, as if he saw something beyond the simple employee she was. Every time he said her name, Alexia felt a shiver. She couldn't tell if it was discomfort or something more. The professionalism of their relationship was dissolving, giving way to something she couldn't define. It was a game she hadn't chosen to enter, but now it seemed impossible to avoid. That afternoon, the tension was even more palpable. She was alone in the office when Mr. X walked in, his words loaded with something else. She knew he wasn't just there to discuss the overdue payment. He wanted something more, something she felt she shouldn't offer. But at the same time, the situation made her afraid of losing everything. It was a familiar feeling, that mix of anxiety and desire, an infidelity story she feared living, but one that was already beginning to seem inevitable. Mr. Rex wasted no time. With a subtle smile, he began talking about Alexia's overdue rent, but his words weren't what she expected to hear. Instead of simply questioning the payment, he began to suggest, in a disguised way, that maybe there was something she could do to resolve the situation. His tone left no room for doubt. He wasn't just talking about money. There was something more behind it, a veiled request she couldn't ignore, but at the same time, she didn't want to understand. Alexia felt uncomfortable. He didn't directly say what he wanted, but his body, his posture, his glances, everything pointed to the same thing. It was a proposal disguised as a solution. Like someone who knows how to play the game, he suggested that the payment of her debt be resolved in a way she knew she shouldn't consider. She felt a chill as she realized he was being deliberately vague, so she could make the decision on her own, without him having to commit. But this suggestion hung in the air like an unspoken confession. Alexia's mind was in turmoil. She knew what was being suggested was wrong, but the pressure was intense. If she accepted, everything would change. If she said no, her financial situation would worsen even further. The idea of giving in seemed simple in theory, but the weight of the decision was crushing. Something inside her wanted to say no, that this was something she should never consider, but the temptation to resolve everything quickly, without further complications, seemed to grow stronger and stronger. As time passed, the tension between Alexia and Mr. X grew. What started as a simple suggestion was turning into something she could no longer control. When he approached, something inside her gave way. She knew it was wrong, but the way he looked at her, the way his presence invaded the space around her, seemed to make everything harder to resist. The unspoken desire was there, growing, and she didn't know how to stop it from taking over her thoughts. Alexia's hesitation was visible, but paradoxically, the feeling of being in danger seemed to be what attracted her even more. She was in an internal conflict, morality fighting against the feelings that arose, even without her permission. She wanted to step back, wanted to shout that this wasn't right, but instead, her eyes stayed fixed on his. With every second that passed, she felt more vulnerable, more tempted to give in to something she knew would lead her down a path with no return. It was the most dangerous moment of her life. Mr. Rex, for his part, seemed to be reading her thoughts. He moved closer, sensing the tension in the air, but didn't advance. Something in his eyes said he was waiting for a sign, a movement that would indicate she was ready to take the step he knew they were both thinking of. However, before anything else could happen, he stepped back, leaving Alexia unsure of what to think. The desire he had awakened in her now seemed even stronger, as if he had ignited a flame she couldn't extinguish. The mutual attraction was in the air, but time was no longer their ally. Days after that tense meeting, Alexia received a message from Mr. Rex, something she hadn't expected. He wanted to resolve what had been left unfinished, what had hung in the air between them. When she read his words, a wave of anxiety swept through her body. The text was simple, but carried a deep emotional weight. He was struggling with his feelings, and more than that, he couldn't get Alexia out of his head. He admitted it plainly. He asked if she felt the same. Reading the message, Alexia didn't know how to react. What he was suggesting was more than just words. It was an opening, a confession of desire and vulnerability that she never imagined he would be capable of making. He had exposed himself, something that didn't happen often, and that left her even more confused. She wanted to say that this was wrong, that he was crossing a line, but at the same time, the part of her that had been attracted to him reignited. What could she respond? She couldn't stop thinking about him either. When she met him in the courtyard, the tension between them was stronger than ever. He was visibly restless, perhaps fearing her response. Alexia looked at him, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. She was confused, but at the same time, a part of her wanted him to say those words again. He asked directly, "Do you feel the same?" The question hung in the air, like a key that could open a door to a world she knew she should avoid. And so, she found herself in a deep dilemma between what she knew was right and what the temptation of the moment was offering. Alexia's internal struggle was at its peak. As much as she knew the situation was wrong, the temptation seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. She was there, face to face with Mr. X, who now looked at her with eyes full of unspoken intentions. It was impossible to deny the desire he had awakened in her, but on the other hand, she knew that crossing that line would mean a point of no return. Reality, with all its consequences, was knocking at the door, and Alexia was torn between following her impulses and keeping her morality intact. The situation dragged on, as if time were stretching. Mr. Rex's gaze, his soft words, everything seemed so inviting. He took a step closer, but before anything could happen, a sound echoed down the hallway. Footsteps approaching. Alexia froze, her mind torn between the relief of not acting and the frustration of not taking things further. The moment that could have changed everything was interrupted, but the desire remained, latent, waiting for the next opportunity. The reality of her personal life now contrasted with the temptation of the moment. Alexia knew that if they gave in, everything would become even more complicated. But what could she do when the desire became so strong that all she wanted was to give into it? She was at the edge of the abyss, where temptation and reality collided in a brutal way. And in that instant, she realized that the greatest challenge wasn't resisting Mr. Rex, but her own lack of control. What would happen when the next opportunity came? The moment was about to take an unexpected turn. The tension in the air was palpable, and Alexia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She was there, about to give in, when the footsteps that were approaching became clearer. It was the familiar sound, but at that moment, it made her freeze. When the door opened, Alexia's husband walked into the courtyard, surprised, but also visibly suspicious. The scene he found was like a frozen photograph. Alexia, standing near Mr. Rex, both with their eyes fixed on each other. The scene seemed surreal, like a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. Alexia's husband's reaction was immediate. Shock took over his face, followed by a wave of anger and confusion. He looked at both of them, unsure if what he was seeing was real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. Alexia, paralyzed, didn't know what to say. What had started as a simple temptation was now turning into an irreversible scene. There was no going back. Alexia's husband wasn't just seeing the betrayal, but also understanding what this meant for their relationship. What would happen next? She knew the consequences would be deep and lasting. Mr. X, on the other hand, seemed calmer than Alexia had imagined. He stepped back without a word, without showing remorse or regret. For him, the game had changed, but not in the way he had expected. While Alexia and her husband locked eyes, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The shocking twist wasn't just what her husband had witnessed, but also what it meant for the future of everyone involved. The story, now marked by betrayal, was just beginning to show its consequences. Now that you've delved into this story of betrayal, it's time to reflect on what you've learned. Temptation can be overwhelming, but the consequences of our actions are often much deeper than we imagine. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? What would your choice be? The truth is, we are all constantly challenged to make tough decisions, but it's these choices that shape our future. The question remains, how far are you willing to go to preserve what truly matters in your life? The impact of such a decision isn't limited only to those directly involved. Relationships can be broken, but they can also be rebuilt if there is a true desire for change. So, what can you learn from this story and apply to your own life? What are you doing to avoid falling into the same temptations and traps? Let's stop living on autopilot and start acting more consciously. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to reflect on your own choices and decisions. Don't let regret guide your life. Instead, seek a life of authenticity and truth. And if you want to continue learning about how decisions, desires, and infidelity can impact your life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next content that will help you reflect and make better decisions for your future.